what came up is that we really needed to people needed to address the barriers that are within the cultural sector and their practice that stopped them doing the transformative and system changing work that they wanted to and that was needed. And it's clear that to us, from our, our own understanding and conversations, and also from our most recent survey, that need remains. And it's been made more acute by the accelerating climate emergency, and brought home this summer by the extreme weather events hitting summer, so hitting Europe. So there's a need again for CDE to ramp up its response and to review its strategy. So from a practical perspective, the outcomes from today and the learning will feed into, well, it will inform a refreshed strategy for the movement, with resources perhaps being redirected and bulked up so the movement can provide the support so you as practitioners can do the work that you need to do, and we can engage in really effective system changing activism. So that's the context for today, and the overarching provocation, which I will let Bridget talk through and provide the framework that we're going to run through today. So I will hand over to Bridget.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. So yes, the overarching provocation is, what do you need and what does the movement need to unlock the agency to create justice, care and welfare in our work, our communities and the planet? So this is broken down into 3 sections, 3 separate provocations. So for the first hour, we'll be talking about, what are you struggling with? What gets in the way of you unlocking agency in this way? How do you keep your compassion and energy for action despite those barriers? So we've got a couple of speakers. We're going to be sort of opened by Eden Rickson with some creative words, and then Gabby Solly is going to talk through her story, and then there'll be some breakout groups for you to talk confidentiality, but with some sharing of key themes and patterns. So that's the first hour, very quick break. Then we go into what inspires hope. So what kinds of practices are working well to create justice, care and welfare that we can amplify, adapt, adopt in our work. So we've got a whole, what we're calling a burst of hope. We've got quite a few brief speakers, and we've also got a wider invitation. Zara, who's here today, has been inviting people on social media to share things, and we'll carry on for a while amplifying this hopeful practice. We also have a Jamboard for the day, a working space that will help us create afterwards a kind of digital zine. So I'm going to share the link for that. Now, you won't all need to use it if you don't want to, but when you're working in groups, we just invite you to have a scribe who will use that Jamboard. So I'm sure by now there are at least, there will at least be one person in each group that knows how to use it, but we can always explain if you need help. Anyway, moving on to the third provocation, which will be after a break. The third one is, what can we do together? So this is about what do we as the movement need to unlock the agency for this work, and what is our energized plan of response to the systemic barriers that are facing us? So when we talk about the movement, we're talking about Culture Declares, but also, our allies, our allied groups of declarers, and anyone really who's working with us in radical cultural action.
Eden Rickson, who's a youth cultural worker and artist, is going to read a poem to kick us off. Eden.
Great, thank you so much. And this poem was in response to the first provocation, which is all about what are we struggling with and what do we need to unlock that care, that agency, that hope. So I'm just going to go straight in. I wonder, what is my place to think about despair? things I haven't suffered, things I don't yet know, things far from me on these western roads, waters that haven't risen yet to my home, fires that haven't burned yet what I own, winds that haven't shaken dry my bones. Is this my grief to own? But I stand and I know there is something in me. Something that sings a siren song, something that knows something is wrong, something buried and roaring for far too long, something quiet, a riot. I'm watching the earth be abused, misused, all reaped and taken from her. Earth is us. Just as she rusts, we might become dust. I'm not dust, I am woman. I speak now, so many other voices push down, down deep, down below. I know, why should I even speak? There is something deep in me. Excavate me, drill me, but my drills don't drive oil spills. My drills are made of trees. My drills do not dig down, they grow up. They grow. This might not be my grief to bear, but the injustice is there. The anger is raw, red, and ripe. She's willing to fight. I know what I feel, and my feelings are mine. How can we think about protecting our mother when our society doesn't protect us? How can I love this earth like my own when sometimes I struggle to love the marrow of my bones? How can we see her as part of our hearts when all some of us might be thinking is how long can we last? There's something in me. There's something in all of you here too. Touch it. Let it roar. In these times, we must do more. In this emergency, what are we fighting for? Thank you.
Eden, that was astonishing. And you've managed to do that in response to the provocation that we only put out very, very recently. And thank you so much. And we're going to make, just to be clear, there will be recordings of the main sessions, obviously not of the breakout rooms, and we will be putting together the digital zine and also reports on an analysis of what comes out of today, which we'll disseminate to everybody. But I'm going to pass over to Gabby now. Gabby Solly, who's an artist again and practitioner based in Bristol and connected to our Southeast Culture Clare hubs. And she's going to tell her own story in response to this first provocation. So Gabby.
Hi there. So I got involved with Culture Declares in 2020 when I was coming to the end of my fine art degree and writing a dissertation on how art can change the world. I was looking for people to link up with in Bristol, where I live, and ended up helping to establish Culture Declares hub in the Southwest. During COVID, we held a dozen or so successful online gatherings and a great performative launch, but the Southwest hub is currently sleeping. I've also been an active member of the Declare Support Working Group, organising and hosting our bi-monthly breakfast gatherings, which has been a really great way of meeting other declarers, getting educated, inspired, and keeping a sense of invigoration with the cause. So I'm just going to share my screen. So my own earth-centered practice weaves together notions of connection and belonging. And I imagine, like most people here, I find the interrelation between human and nature endlessly fascinating. I work in a variety of media and materials and move between the poetic, the participative, the political, the performative, and the pragmatic. So you might have noticed on Culture Declare's homepage, there's a picture of somebody wearing a leaf mask. That's me, and it's one of a series of masks that I made to acknowledge our reliance on trees to breathe. I went on to make a full nature immersion hood out of ginkgo leaves, which I wore in different ways and in different places to enter into states of nature connection and nature disconnection. I'd like to make a full-length hooded cloak out of the massive fig leaves in my garden this autumn. But I'm still working out what the exact point of the cover-up commentary would be and where I might wear it to best effect. If anyone wants to talk through it, ideas, suggestions, I'll be very grateful. Last year I worked as an artist and a maker and a co-producer with fellow declarer Kelly Hill on a Paint the Lamb project for Writers Rebel. I made bones out of branches to spell out the words of Jay Griffiths in the short film that we made at Tinton Abbey, which was voiced by Mark Rylance, addressing the value and the loss of insect biodiversity. And the final words that we made spelled out insects are truly the angels. The bone branches have been resurrected this year to use in ceremonies at a couple of solidarity actions in support of rainforest activists in Sarawak in Borneo. One was at the Tate Modern in January under Cecilia Vicuna's Dead Forest Kipu in the Turbine Hall. And just last weekend, our campaign to clean up the tropical timber trade gathered people together outside London Zoo, and I'm really glad to see Hannah from Mint Street here, who was part of that action. So I've used the bone branches also to form spiral structures for the main ritual space at this year's Buddha Field. They've travelled across the UK with me, and I've grown quite attached to them. So saying all of this out loud makes me realise that maybe I'm slightly more productive than what I often give myself credit for. I know I've got good ideas. I know that I can produce good work, and that other people often see me apparently sailing along, but what they don't see is my legs desperately paddling under the water to keep me from drowning. And so here I am, 3 years further on from graduation, an early career artist with middle-age spread. It's a situation that's both much easier and much harder than if I'd started out in my 20s. Everything often feels a bit much, and I'm not afraid to admit it, which I guess is why I'm here speaking today. So what am I struggling with? What gets in the way of me unlocking my agency to create justice, care and welfare? Well, to be honest, writing this presentation has been a really good kick up the arse for me. It's a reason to make me face my stuckness head on. It's brought into sharp relief the difficulties I face with creating work on a daily basis, and to delve into what it really is that's getting in the way. I had a go at brainstorming barriers to my practice, and they're numerous. Listing them made it apparent why I often feel so overwhelmed. Some of the reasons are practical, with clear ways to overcome them, if only I had the wherewithal to do it. I have no studio space and no immediate collaborative community. I have no funding nor experience of how to apply for it. My practice is indistinctly defined, as is my expertise. I have caring responsibilities. I'm currently unemployed. More obstacles, however, relate in some way or other to my somewhat precarious state of being and mental health, both complicated and clarified by a recent diagnosis of ADHD. And this is spiced up further by the interesting developmental stage of perimenopause. So I hope it's obvious that I'm saying all of this not for sympathy, but just to be plain and honest in sharing my vulnerability, letting go of shame and acknowledging that I'm not alone in my messy journey towards radical self-acceptance. On the way to hopefully finding my power, I keep stumbling over and over, tripping up on self-doubt, sometimes even on self-loathing, falling into hopelessness, despair, and anxiety. I carry imposter syndrome everywhere I go, and it holds on tight to my fear of failure and judgment. I'm an easily distracted, perfectionist procrastinator who finds it hard to prioritize when everything is important or worthy of attention. It's hard to know where to begin and often impossible to finish, especially on time. And all of these barriers, practical and emotional, are pushed and pulled by our out of date, out of place, out of whack, patriarchal, capitalist, neo-colonial society and the intensifying, terrifying Earth crisis it has engendered. Eco-burnout is definitely a thing. And I'm tired after a lifetime of sticking my head above the parapet, being a thorn in the side and part of the awkward squad. And it's not like I even feel like I'm doing anything like enough to address the climate and nature crises. In fact, most of the time, I feel like a total hypocrite, banging on about ecological breakdown one day and driving to Tesco's the next. Ugh. And I know that we all need to start from the place we're at and keep reminding ourselves of that. And maybe I also need to lower my expectations and get better at acceptance and letting go. So how do I keep my compassion and energy for action for myself and for others? Well, briefly, this year I turned 50 in April. It was on the first Friday of the big one in London, a long weekend of protest around Parliament attended by more than 60,000 people and hundreds of environmental and social justice organisations convened by Extinction Rebellion. On my 50th birthday, I led a march of 70 Red Rebels, followed by the landing crew, climate choirs, samba bands, and thousands of protesters from Trafalgar Square through Westminster. Bar giving birth, it was up there as the most bizarre and intense experience of my life. So here I was at the heart of the biggest gathering of fellow eco-justice activists that there's ever been in the UK, and the vibes were potent and nourishing. Red Rebels embody the lifeblood that connects all creatures and exist to bear witness to the vulnerability of action, to see and to be seen, to stand outside the everyday and to suggest a different way of being. And I was helping to bring all of this energy forward to the seat of our government. So for me, community and creativity are the things that feed my energy for action. And acts of solidarity help to nurture my feelings of compassion, both for myself and for others. And so does mindfulness. I try to meditate every morning as much as possible, though this goes in waves. But I'm on a good streak currently, though. I'm in therapy, which is a lifesaver, and my dog takes me out on a walk into nature most days. I enjoy talking to strangers and friends and appreciate the sense of helping to grow humanity's mycelium and humanity's energetic mycelium, joining people up with invisible threads of compassionate trust in order that we're better able to face the great unraveling together, to learn to become our best human selves in spite of everything that has gone before. And thank you for being part of this growing network too.
Yeah, I think we all want to give you some love, Gabby. Thank you. That was just, you know, and we can all see ourselves in a lot of what you said, and brave and generous of you to share that all with us. So can we just give Gabby some more love? Thank you. Bridget, I think you're going to organise.
Yes. So you will have 20 minutes to chat in your breakout groups.
So we've heard quite fully about some of the challenges that we've been facing and how some of those structural and systemic barriers can affect us, you know, emotionally and somatically. So now we're going to talk about what inspires us and what practice we can draw on, and the kinds of practice that are working well to create care and welfare. So we'll have a sort of series of people speaking, and we'll also, I think, talk a little about our Culture Takes Action, which is our online sharing, and we'll share a little of those stories as well. So, but first I'm going to ask Elaine Mullings to speak, who is an artist based on the southeast coast. Hi, thank you, Elaine. And then from Elaine's going to talk a little longer, and then we're going to have a kind of quick fire introduction to some people's work who are sort of working in that space effectively. So, and I will put their names in the chat, and also so they know which order they're going to go in. But if everybody could introduce themselves a bit, that will just sort of cut off me sort of rambling on. So Elaine, welcome, thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak, because I really didn't know if what I had to say would be of value, but I'm really glad for the opportunity to talk about well, the work that I've been doing sort of personally in my practice. So firstly, to talk a little bit about myself. I was born in London to West Indian parents. My parents came from Jamaica in the 50s. And so I grew up there in London, and my dad was a carpenter. My mum was a homemaker, and my dad, as a carpenter joiner, you know, worked very hard on the building sites and you know, rebuilding Britain after the war. And he never threw anything away. For him, everything had value. So he was always collecting. If someone threw something away at work, he would bring it home. And so he had this sort of sustainable practice himself before it was a fashionable thing. He always could see the use in something. And so I think I inherited that from him. I don't throw things away, and that, you know, if I can help it. And I always felt that it was really important to use everything, repurpose, etc. And it's only as I've got older, I've realized that that is inherent practice of my own also informs my work, because I'm always looking in my practice at ways of drawing attention to the value of things and materials, things that we often see as disposable or throw away. I'm always really keen to use materials and show that that cheap material like tissue paper or I don't know, a plastic bag has a value, and it has a value in that somebody else is paying for it, because that's why it's cheap, because someone is paying for it in the global south. So more recently, well, I suppose I can go back to just before the pandemic. I was feeling quite cynical about the world, and I was feeling quite cynical after Brexit, and particularly with the migration crisis, etc., and how the right-wing presses was denigrating us or denigrating people, and by proxy denigrating people like me and my heritage. But in having the opportunity to make work, it's through my work that I'm able to talk about some of those issues. Sorry, I feel a bit nervous talking about it. So I could talk about more recently. I was in a show called We Out Here in Hastings Contemporary. And in that show, I was able to talk more publicly for the first time about my feelings about the exploitation of the global south, and in particular in Africa, and in particular in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I was able to draw people's attention to cobalt as a beautiful material. It's an ore, and 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we see it as this beautiful blue that we've often seen in things like pottery, ceramics. But it was drawing people's attention to the fact that it's in all of our electrical batteries. And that while in the West, we're very much developing a green ecology, drive to be more sustainable. But that cost for that green energy is being paid for by people in the global south, and particularly in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I made a sculpture, quite a large piece, and if you look at my website, you'll get a chance to see the sort of work that I do, but this work in particular. And I thought it was what was invigorating to me, and what was rewarding to me was the amount of conversations I was able to have with people about something that they hadn't thought of. So it was a way of being very personal and having one-to-ones with people and drawing their attention to why I'd use these particular materials. I created the work from copper, beautiful copper rings, and wood. And then I had these little people populate the area, bright blue, cobalt blue. And so while it was a very playful piece and it drew people in, I was able to then, once they were in and interested and engaged, talk about the issues. And even if they didn't know the issues, they would question why are these people here? Why are they blue, etc. But we had an enormous, lots of opportunity to talk to people and make them aware that those mobile phones, while they were wonderful things to have, somebody else was paying a high price for it. Also, we were able to do for We Out Here, which was a group of 6 Black artists of Caribbean heritage based in Hastings. We were able to talk about other issues, and that was important to us. And one of them was fast fashion. Maggie Scott did a beautiful piece that looked at waste capitalism. And so our 2 pieces were quite interconnected, because we were both looking at capitalism from different perspectives and how it's affecting the climate, because the extraction of cobalt on this massive scale by indigenous people is polluting their landscapes and polluting the people. And so Maggie was talking about how fast fashion was also polluting the landscape. So through art and through our practices and through this show, we were able to start to engage with people without them feeling overwhelmed and fearful. You know, the works we produced were a way of people, you know, being able to insert the arguments and insert the conversations without people feeling overwhelmed. And I think that's a thing that people often experience. They think it's too big a subject to deal with. So I feel through our practices, we were able to, through our pieces that we did for the show, we were able to start to draw people in. And another way that we were able to engage with people is through our workshops. And I ran a workshop called Art as Protest, and looked at different ways that artists can engage with people, through how artists do engage with people through their practices, but how it is possible for us as individuals through our practices as artists to talk about climate crisis, to talk about different issues that affect us. And at the same time, Maggie was able to do something about fast fashion. So we were able to interconnect, you know, because all of the issues do intersect. They're not just one issue. And so through our practices, we were able to demonstrate that. And I was very much inspired by the COP26 in Glasgow. And I read the report for that, and it was really enlightening to see that through art, people were engaging. That art, the people outside the discussions, the people outside doing art engagement, were the people that are able to cut through to the public in a way that, you know, the news or the establishment can't. So I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I'm excited, and I suppose that's one of the things in our breakout group. I had a little rant about all the things that used to upset me and still do. But what I found more recently is that I'm very optimistic. But by coming through my practice, I'm able to engage with people, but also seeing the work that's being done by Culture Declares Emergency, but also things like complicity. Recently, during our show, we had the opportunity, initiated through Polly, to see the film. It was screened here locally, and it was just a brilliant film, and it was able to talk about racism and the climate crisis, and how Black people or people from the global South are not necessarily in the West, are not necessarily engaged with the issues, because they feel A, overwhelmed, and B, because other things preoccupy them, like jobs, like food, work. So yeah, altogether, I feel very optimistic, and I think through my practice and through connecting with other artists, we can move forward. Thank you.
Elaine, thank you. That's inspiring to hear you speak about your work, which is fantastic. You know, the weaving together of your activism and your work in a very inspiring and positive and optimistic way. So thank you for sharing. We're going to jump in now and have 3 minutes each from Victor Mac Smith of Rhythms of Resistance, Lucy Neal from Walking Forest, Julie Ward, who's going to talk about the Cultural Care Report, Dorcas Taylor for Scarborough Museums and Galleries to talk about A Space to Be, Heather Ackroyd will talk a little about her practice and praxis in regenerative culture, and Elena, and I'm so sorry, Elena, I didn't get your surname in here, who's from the UBI, who's going to talk about universal basic income, which might sort of respond positively to some of our issues around precarity and funding and so on. So can we start with Victor?
Hey everyone. Yeah, so I'm Victor. My pronouns are they, them. I live in London on a boat at the moment. And I'm currently a PhD student at SOAS. And what I wanted to talk about today was my experiences with my form of activism, which is banging drums at protests. And what I think I've learned from it and why I think it's really valuable from a regenerative well-being kind of point of view, as well as from a point of view of making a lot of noise. So my backstory is that I basically had 10 years of doing nothing but living in my bedroom because I was a neurodivergent trans kid who did not have the words to describe what I was or even understand what I was myself. So I created this persona of being like super scary and super serious, and I was just going to isolate myself from the entire world and keep people away from me because people suck and the world sucks. And then I got my diagnosis, found that I was autistic, started figuring out my gender identity, and was beginning to put these things in place. But really what was the final piece for me was joining a samba fusion band in my university in September 2019, just before the International Rebellion in October 2019. And there were bands everywhere, lots of huge, great big samba fusion bands. I'm saying samba fusion because we're not samba. What we play is samba-ish, but definitely not authentic, definitely not Brazilian. And through watching what these bands were doing and watching how the media was reacting, I was realizing that really the most scary, the most radical thing we were doing was making mistakes and being silly and being very, 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 very open about that we are just amateurs and we are making mistakes and we're being very silly and we're playing lots of silly drums and running around. And even from activists, even from XR activists who work alongside bands and can see how useful we are in attracting attention and claiming space, there is still a lot of stigma around silliness. And there is still a lot of stigma around making mistakes and looking a bit imperfect. And for me, I think that first, this has really radical potential. It has really radical potential because the weapon of the state is violence and intimidation. And if you are trying to arrest a clown, then you become part of the circus when the state reacts with violence against silly, fun, non-violent activism. They are very much showing how ridiculous the idea is of being aggressive, being violent towards people who just want to prevent climate collapse. Second, I think from a personal point of view, being silly and embracing mistakes, and most importantly, being part of a community where you can make mistakes and you are not belittled for that, can be just incredibly empowering, and it can be the starting point that people need to come into themselves and understand themselves and claim their power. So yeah, that's my little thing. Doesn't need to be a band, just do silly things, find a community where people welcome silliness and welcome the growth that comes with making mistakes and learning about ourselves. So yeah, hope that wasn't too long.
Brilliant, perfect. Thank you, Victor. I love silliness as a radical action. I look forward to hearing reading about your PhD. I'll go to Julie Ward if that's all right.
Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about not a report actually, but a manifesto that has the title Handle with Care, Envisioning a Culture of Care. And this manifesto was co-created by nearly 200 people at the Culture Action Europe Beyond the Obvious conference in the European Capital of Culture in Elefsina in June. And it has 8 different sections in it, and the first section is about care for the climate, but then it goes on to talk about care for borders, care for the commons, communities of care, care and mental health, care and youth, care for the work of culture and curating care. And I should say, when we talk about care for borders, it's not about maintaining borders, but about recognizing that borders are often a place of violence and sorrow. So this was a very powerful, it seemed an almost impossible task actually, to bring 200 people from across different European countries, not EU countries, but wider Europe, into the same space to sit together in circles to write these these kind of commitments. But the final manifesto, which I'll post in the chat later, is very meaningful, I think. Elefsina as a place is in one of the most ancient cities, and it's the place where Persephone descended into darkness, and then there was a subsequent transformation, and this for us was a real inspiration. And in fact, the city also, the bay in Elefsina is one of the most polluted bays in the world. It has a graveyard of rusting, toxic ships. So to kind of do this manifesto in this environment actually felt really really important. And it actually begins with saying to care is to act. And I think that that's also something that we do in Culture Declares Emergency. We practice radical hope, and action is one of the things that we try and promote. So if I've got time, I'll just read the bit about Care for Climate. We as human beings recognize our interconnections with all beings and the intricate web of systems that sustain life on our ancient planet. Our actions today shape the path for future generations, and our ability to transform the world has brought us to a critical moment. The climate crisis is not only a crisis of science, technology, or financial resources, it's a crisis of care. To avert catastrophe, care must be at the forefront of our efforts, transcending boundaries from the personal to the global. Culture is a vital resource for this global work of care, providing the foundation for transformative action. By fostering transnational institutions, alliances and networks based on interdependency and democracy, we can enact a politics of care on a global scale. And then we went on to say, as Culture Action Europe, which is a network of networks, really, how we would be doing that. So I will post the link. There's also a little bit of a film of us reading it. And I would urge people to look at how they could adopt and use this manifesto in their own work. But I would also love to see more people from the UK particularly, but other countries and places, join Culture Action Europe, because transcending boundaries of all kinds is something that's really, really important right now. How we can show solidarity with people in other countries and people working within different practices. So I don't know if I've got any more time left, but
I think but that was terrific and really exciting to hear about the manifesto. And we'll definitely share the links to that after the event, if you could pop that in the chat. Thank you very much, Julie. Can we go to Lucy Neal?
I'm mid-facilitating a residential workshop. We're just on the edge of Dartmoor at Blackadon, and I am one of 4 artists in Walking Forest, which is a 10-year public art project, creating links between forest ecology and the undertold stories, particularly when they are women-led in earth defending. And we are in the middle of a 3-year research project with quite a broad group of disciplines within science, looking at the memory of trees in the sense that how trees respond to current stresses, which can include drought and flooding, and also increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So I'm here with a range of climate scientists, tree scientists, molecular biologists, ecologists. We're just taking a break, but everybody's coming back at 11. And the question we're asking during this residency is in terms of what our different practices and disciplines are. What is it between us during this research period that we might do ambitiously together, and how might our work from different disciplines of science and humanities and classics are included, and also the arts, and how might our shared vision impact on government policy, on individual agency, citizenship, public realm, multi-species communities in the wider world, culture and the arts. Hello, everybody. The law, the wider treescapes, and the future of academic, interdisciplinary and scientific research. And just before people went on a break, we did this collective make where we just began to play and sketch out what that combined research might afford. And it's 11 o'clock now, and I must go because everybody's coming back. So I'm sorry to be so brief, but hopefully the manifestations of treescapes and walking forest will manifest itself in the world, and we will be able to communicate that in forms later. So here comes everybody coming back from their break, and I'm going to say goodbye and thank you very much. Cheerio then. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lucy, for your action video, live action from Dartmoor. Well done. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Lucy. Can we go to Dorcas from Scarborough Museums and Galleries?
Yes, hello everybody. It's really nice to be here. Thank you, Victoria, for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we're doing here at Scarborough Museums. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm a white middle-aged woman with curly brown hair tied back. I've got glasses on and I'm wearing a grey top. We're in the middle of installing 3 exhibitions here in Scarborough. So I apologise if you can hear noises and things going on in the background. I'm head of programmes at Scarborough Museums. We're up in North Yorkshire. For those of you that don't know where Scarborough is, we're on the coast. We're about an hour's drive away from York, which is our closest city. Yeah, I'm head of programmes, which sounds grand, but it isn't. We run 3 venues. We have Scarborough Art Gallery, the Rotunda Museum, and Wood End. I'm also, and I'm going to be honest, I'm also a very vulnerable person, and I have I have low self-esteem, and I'm also hyper self-critical. So it's lovely to be in a caring environment and meeting new and compassionate people, and I feel that it feels like a very welcoming space to be in, so thank you. So I'm just going to briefly tell you a bit about a space that we have here, which you could loosely describe as a community space, but it doesn't really do it justice. It's called A Space to Be, and it is a kind of engagement space which is very much built on a sense of reciprocity between us as an organisation and our communities and the individuals who we are here for, who we serve. It started as a bit of an experiment. So basically it's one of the galleries that in fact, it was my favourite gallery space, so I had to wrestle it away from other people to turn it into this hub, if you like. It started as a kind of exploration to start building up a much more authentic relationship with our communities. And that was by inviting groups in and also establishing weekly drop-in days so that we could start to learn more about what people want from us, but also so that we could actually learn from our communities. And we have a very diverse group of people that now interact with us. This has been going for probably about 18 months. We have recently declared and are organising an assembly to ensure that it's our communities who are going to determine what this means for Scarborough, and hopefully as a model to develop further across North Yorkshire, and also how we as an institution and the individuals that we're working with can work together. It's really important that this is led by our communities, and that we don't, it's a really difficult one, isn't it? When you as an organisation are kind of kickstarting something, but you don't want to control it. So we're going to be looking through the assembly to really make sure we pull ourselves back, and we do a lot of listening and planning with our communities. There's a sense, there's a focus on the hyperlocal, which is important in a place like Scarborough, because it's rural, and it has a very kind of clear identity. So you, in a way, for us, the focus is on the hyperlocal, so that then people can start gradually making connections beyond the local. And this is something that we've already started to do through our exhibitions programme. And again, I think it's really important to say that we don't do things in chimneys. We try and make sure there's synergy between all our activities. Do stop me if I'm talking too quickly or if I'm saying too much. But I will just mention an exhibition which, or a whole 1.5 year long project we did called From Local to Global. And this might be actually of interest to you, Elaine, because it was based around a collection that we have, a collection of objects that we acquired through the colonial activities of a big game hunter called Harrison. We have a large collection of Congolese objects. So we spent a lot of time really working through the objects, the impact of colonialism on Congo, and also its legacy, particularly looking at the environmental legacy from colonialism. And we did that with volunteers and people I called citizen researchers. So we were already recognising that actually, although we're in Scarborough, through the museum, because we have these global collections, and most of them are all really the result of colonial violence, we can use those to unpack Scarborough's great bigger influence in relation to climate justice. So that was kind of running. So we have things, so then that feeds into what happens in Space to Be. So then individuals and groups start to interact with our exhibition programme, and that then stimulates conversations and discussions. And so it's very much, we might plant seeds, if you like, but then the people that we're talking to then decide how they want to take these things further. So what we've been doing for the last 18 months really has been around relationship building, and this is so important. We have created a really caring and nurturing and welcoming place for our communities, and we haven't parachuted in anything. We've built it from a very much a roots upward sort of level. And that's really, really been wonderful to see, actually, because that means that as we start moving into wider discourses around the environment, we can also look at how the environment intersects with our different communities, the environmental issues. So, for example, because a lot of the groups that and individuals we work with have particular disabilities, we have people that living with neurodivergence, and that's important to me as someone who is neurodivergent, people living with mental illness, and people with physical disabilities. We can bring their lived experiences into our exploration of the Earth crisis. So it's really being led by them.
Sorry, okay.
So that's where it's really positive. Sorry, Victoria.
Sorry, it'll be fascinating to hear you talk more about it, but we're going to have to cut you off now.
That's okay. That's okay. If I've got, I won't be able to stay for much longer, I'm afraid, because I've got, we're installing. What I was just going to quickly say, and again, you can feed this through, Victoria, is what some of the problems have been, because I do think when you talk about, I think challenges can sometimes be more interesting to hear about than the successes, although I know this is very much looking at inspiring models. So there we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorcas, for sharing that. And I think people will be able to find out more through the Scarborough Museums and Galleries websites, and also through the hub that's forming. You'll be able to opportunities to share your learning as you go along. But thank you. Can we move to Heather Ackroyd?
Thank you so much, Victoria, and really pleased to be here. So I have a 33-year collaborative practice with artist Dan Harvey, and I'd like to just specifically talk about a body of work we've made in the last few months. We were one of 15 artists who took part in an exhibition, Dear Earth, Art and Hope in a Time of Crisis, at the Hayward Gallery in London as part of the Planet Summer, addressing the climate and ecological crisis. Dan and I made a series of what we call these photosynthesis photographic images, where we work with the exquisite, beautiful, magical pigment chlorophyll to make these biochemical photographic images. They were quite large, 5, nearly 2.5 meters. And we worked very closely with campaigners, all part of collectives who are in one way or another addressing the abuses upon land, upon water, upon forests, upon soil. And they work collectively, and this was very, very important that we had this shared dialogue. And specifically, we were working with Julian Lahai Taylor from Grow Lewisham, permaculture and organic food growing, Helen Schultz from the London Freedom Seed Bank, Destiny Boca-Bateza. They work with a collective, teenage collective when they started up, Choked Up, Love Sega, who's been part of a collective called Live and Breathe, again, fighting for clean air in areas of South London, and Paul Parsland, who is one of the co-founders of Lawyers for Nature and also the River Roding Trust. Their presence was manifested through chlorophyll. And every step of the process, we were engaged in conversations. When it came to any press or discussions, we always asked our collaborators to be part of that as well. And we were part of the closing ritual 2 weeks ago, which was actually very, very moving. The piece of work that we did is essentially about the commons, and it's about care, and it is about healing abuses that have happened over weeks, as of when sewage is disgorged into rivers, but healing over centuries as well. And the bigger questions we had were, why is the UK one of the most nature depleted countries in the world? Why in England do people only have public access to around 3% of rivers and 8 to 10% of public land? And what is the link between the Enclosure Acts between 1600s and the early 1900s? Over 5,200 acts of parliament happened to take land away from the common people, and the land was essentially what we'd now call privatized. 1/5 of England has been lost within those within those centuries. And what is the link between colonization and what was happening in this country with the Enclosure Acts and the industrialization? And Vandana Shiva, in her profoundly important book, Reclaiming the Commons, which has just been re-edited, just succinctly put it in one sentence. Colonialism is Enclosure Act on a global scale. And so I would argue as well that the past never leaves us, as many people do as well, from many, many cultures who live in a way that works within a circular time frame. So this is where, for me, regeneration lies. History is present, it plays out every step of the way. There has to be accountancy, we have to hold people to account. And I think activism is absolutely central to that. We have to face harsh realities to do with histories, but we have to place care, and we have to place healing and regeneration of nature at the core of this, and be in service. And I just wish to thank the collaborators, Dan, and all of you for being here today to share this journey and this process. And we're learning every step of the way. And I say this with love. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. That was a terrific sharing, and love back to you. Can we go to Eleanor? Eleanor Cloud is from Universal Basic Income Lambeth, who's going to talk a little to the kind of positive work she's doing to address some of the systemic challenges that we all very much face in terms of our incomes. So Eleanor.
Hello there, good morning. It's great to hear about some of your projects. I'm very interested in people creating new value, not necessarily commercial, and new ways of doing things, because I think that systemically this is a way of combating some of our financial pressure and some of the commercial pressure that we are under, not to mention the ecological pressures. I'm lucky to be a part of a network, the UBI Lab network, which is citizens, researchers, activists, communities, looking at systemic change and how UBI might be part of that. And for me personally, how UBI might balance our system, our local economies, and the activities that we do. A little bit about precarity. 74% people in poverty are in work. 74% in London are actually in work. So precarity is beyond intermittent work, gigs. It is also part of not just the structure of the work that we're doing, and particularly in the arts, but it is part of the fact that wages no longer sustain us. And this has been happening since the 70s, and most since 2012-13. So Reinhard is here. He could tell you more specifically about a basic income project involved by the Arts Lab and Leeds Lab and people in Ireland. It has given money to 2,000 artists and 1,000 artists as a control group. The sum is about 1,100 a month, and it's taxable, but it's meant exactly to deal with precarity and also just to make it possible for people to have the time to look for work, because that's a full-time job in itself, especially with the admin, as people have said. It's very early stages. We don't know much about what's going on. It started end of last year. What we do know is that, well, I find this very interesting in terms of what people have said about give and take and how do we support each other. We do know that some of the artists on the program have met and have realized that they have a basic income. So I'd be curious to see how you have a sort of a small community effect there. How do people support each other? Are they becoming audiences for each other or working together? Because the idea of a universal is that everybody gets it, and then the roots and connections and synapses that we have between us, then they can really come alive. Another project which the UBI Lab Network was instrumental in, again, not working alone, but with other people, is Lab Wales, who created a basic income for workers in heavy industries to transition to green industries, or to green sectors. And the beauty of that is that the definition of a green job is just anything, technically it's anything that's not heavy industry, heavy production. So it incorporates care jobs, care work. It incorporates the arts and creativity. So it's a way for us to transition to something better. I feel encouraged that there are various systemic solutions around, also like the 4-day week, which would actually reduce carbon emissions by as much as 22%. So that's huge. But it wouldn't look after precarious workers, arts workers. It wouldn't look after women in unpaid care. I'd like to say that the reason that UBI is systemic is because it's a combination of people's behavior on the ground and how that touches the superstructure, the corporations. And it gives people a chance to say no to toxic, extractive jobs with no prospects. And specifically, it disrupts the way that we work, which is the efficiency, which is creating more and more, but putting in less and less. That's the problem. How can we face our challenges if we're trying to make more and more with less and less? And so once you have that situation, it's possible for a social transformation where the supply chains are not, extractive, energy seeking, but the supply chains are made up of our imaginations and our creativity to serve the needs of humanity, and to elevate ourselves and to support ourselves and find new ways of doing things, which are less material and less production based. So we can be making, because we are generative, but what are we making? So that's the reason why UBI is interesting. It's a capacity for social transformation and for transforming the economic superstructure. If people can't have choice over their time or over their money, then how can we make these possible things come to pass? So wherever people are rethinking or redesigning democratically new ways of doing things, it's very exciting. I worry about growth, about what is growth, how we growing. A lot to say about that, but for instance, on a simple level, we have profit-based growth. We've seen that doesn't work, it doesn't trickle down, but there's also other types. There's wage-based growth. You can guess what that is. And there is quality-based growth. So how can we reach prosperity? Or rather, it's possible to reach prosperity through growing through equality. Maybe slightly involved here, but I find it interesting that one recipe of what sort of economic shape we could have. Sorry, is there time? Are you about to say I should stop? I'm not sure.
You're not 30 seconds.
30 seconds, okay. So one thing that I find interesting is that the recipe for a shape of our economy, what is that? Where do we find the prosperity from? And moving away from the extraction and the globalization. So one thing that I've come across is the idea that you have a foundational economy, which is our everyday economy, including the arts. And on top of that, you have some export and some trade, but not as much as people think is necessary. And on top of that, you add high value, which is the arts, which is the professions, which is certain types of manufacture. And when you add the high value through the arts, then you can create public goods which will then sustain us. So those are the sort of things that I find interesting. There's an artist here, Alice Clark, who I just met on Sunday. I'm glad that some of you have had a chance to meet her. She's a brilliant example of new ways of doing things. She can tell you herself, but she's a painter, an amazing painter, and you can buy a painting from her for £100, or you could do 4 hours of activism. This is a brilliant idea. Really taps into creating new value and new ways of doing things, which I believe UBI could do. It also helps her support activism, which she's very interested in. So it's nice to meet you again.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you.
That was really terrific and inspiring to see us learn about this transformative, emancipatory, systemic solution. And there has been, there was a group started on CDE with Mike Pryor and Reinhardt, I think, who is here. So, you know, if that's inspiring people to learn more about that and support that, then please get in touch and we can connect you with those people. But thank you, Elena. Okay, Bridget, over to you. We are running a little bit late, so we are going to borrow a bit from the break, and we may end up running a tiny bit at the end. But
I'm actually going to suggest we don't borrow from breaks. I think breaks are really important. And I'm even going to suggest you take the time right now, if you'd like, just 30 seconds, you know, a minute, maybe. Nah, I know it's not enough time, but in 20 minutes, there will be time for a 10-minute break. So now the idea is that that you go back into your groups, as this is a kind of assembly. So this is quite a lot of, you know, circle discussion as before. Try and find time so that each person can briefly talk. And the question for this is, you know, what brings you hope? What feels hopeful in my world of creativity and or activist practice? What is actually helping to unlock agency? So you might reflect either on the kind of artistic and cultural world, or, you know, to talk more systemically about some of the things like UBI or methods of exchange and living. So I'm going to open the groups examples. Some of the examples here have already been talked about. I wanted to pick up there on Ben Okri's book, Tiger Work, if you haven't read it. Something that we were going to ask them to speak, but they couldn't, is the Festival of Thrift, the national celebration of sustainable living. That's worth checking out. I've given you here on the top left corner a little bit of a gift, which is some ideas of regenerative ways of life and work inspired by seed forms, and I hope that's helpful and useful. We can see some shares coming here, and you might carry on adding a few later. So we've got shares like, pleasure activism. I like that idea. Pleasure activism, transformative justice, taking inspiration from the hyperlocal, being allowed to admit to vulnerability, people feeling empowered through doing naughty things, disobedience, doing everyday things together as creative communities, building connection, believing in the diversity of models. So there's quite a lot there about permission, allowance, freedom, creativity, but also rootedness in community. So maybe those are some themes to bring up in the next round after your 10-minute break, which can start from now. So we'll see you at the top of the hour.
We will be sharing all the biogs and the links to the speakers from today, and I'm just popping in Eden Rickson's LinkedIn. If you joined later, you wouldn't have seen that, and she wrote and performed a poem for us early in the session, and we will share that too, but just so you have that there with you, and enjoy your breaks. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you've had a stretch and a drink. So we're coming into the third provocation, which is what we can do together and what the movement needs to unlock the agency for this work, and looking towards an energized plan of response to the systemic barriers that face us. And with that in mind, we are going to hear from three speakers: Chris Gerald from Culture Unstained, and he's going to talk about the systemic power issues relating to funding. And then we'll go to Amy from Fund Palaces, who's going to talk about their work creating spaces for cultural democracies in communities. And then finally, Bridget's going to talk through some of the work, the existing frameworks that Culture Declares has for engaging in and supporting the sorts of work that we would like to be supported doing. So if I hand over to Chris, if you don't mind introducing yourself fully and taking it from there. So Chris Gerard, Culture Unstained.
Sure, thank you. I will just bring up these slides and check they work for everyone first. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Seems good, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Chris Garrett. I'm co-director of Culture Unstained in one part of my life, but I'm also, I guess, like a creative activist. So I run an activist choir. Actually, how I first came to know Bridget as well, but that's a separate story as well. But yeah, so lots of like creative activism in what I do as well. But this morning, and firstly, apologies that I haven't been here for the whole of the event, just very in the midst of a busy week, but I hope that I can share something useful in this session now, and I'm really looking forward to it. So in a sort of short space of time, I want to just share a kind of short story about one of our bits of campaigning at the moment around the Science Museum in London. And the purpose of this is because it's a particularly egregious example, but I recognize that it's a very particular example, but I think the value of talking about it and pointing to it is that there are different kinds of ways that it points to the systemic kind of challenges and barriers we might come up against. And then hopefully, if I move quick enough through the slides, we'll land in a place which is maybe just inviting some thinking about how we can respond to those issues as well. And like I say, some of the kind of context around the Science Museum might look particularly egregious, but there are much more subtle or nuanced ways that we might come up against these kinds of issues in our own work, in our own art making, within our own organizations as well. So London Science Museum, right before the COP26 Climate Summit, announced a new sponsorship deal with the Indian conglomerate Adani. And the Adani Group is involved in a whole range of businesses, so infrastructure, airports, trains, weapons and aerospace, this kind of thing, but is particularly known for its involvement in coal production and also the construction of coal-fired power stations. And Adani would become the sponsor, or is becoming the sponsor, of the Science Museum's new climate gallery, Energy Revolution. And the loophole the Science Museum has used is saying, rather than partnering with the whole company, we are just partnering with the little bit that does the renewable energy. And there's all kinds of evidence showing that that doesn't really hold up anyway. But what does this look like? And this is the thing I think we have to keep in mind as climate justice activists, is on the ground in Australia, traditional owners there have resisted Adani's Carmichael coal mine for a long time, and they're kind of obscured from view. And the coal that's being extracted there is then transported by sea to India and is now being burned in a new coal-fired power station in Godda, which was resisted by Adivasi women and Adivasi communities in India as well. And they're also involved in resisting kind of other extraction projects there. One important thing with Adani is, yes, they are involved in creating solar farms and so on, but that also involves land grabbing, the taking of indigenous lands, clearing of woodland, and so on as well. So we need to be aware of the risks of green colonialism that's hidden in there as well. And the role of the kind of sponsorship and the partnership is this capturing of narratives that happens. So this is a little extract from an email that we got hold of from someone quite senior at the Science Museum, and written in collaboration with the director. But it's this new gallery was pitched to Adani as being the strongest global profiling opportunity for Adani, and that because it closely aligns with Adani's ambitions, it will deliver to them the greatest benefits. So I think one of the challenges we face when we take a step back is we can sort of look to funders and partners and collaborations from our perspective, of how they interact with us and the cultural space. But what we have to remember is these companies and so on come with an agenda and a way of building their web of influence. So are we maintaining our agency, or are we kind of resisting that influence where it happens? And especially where people in powerful positions across the sector are kind of allying themselves more with the polluters than the people. There's also a thread of cronyism that can come on, that can come through. And like I say, I'm pointing to the most egregious examples. So this was the signing ceremony for this sponsorship deal. You see the director, the chair of the Science Museum, and then Gautam Adani, the owner of the company. But this happened during the government's Global Investment Summit, just 2 weeks before the COP. So Gautam Adani with then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who I'm sure we all fondly miss. But then Boris Johnson visited their headquarters in India. But also Gautam Adani is very close with Narendra Modi as well. So there is this constant intersecting and overlapping of different relationships as well. And the reason I sort of shine a spotlight on that is sometimes if we think we're coming into contact with an organization, a company, a funder, actually there's a lot of other pieces that might be in play from their side as well that we just need to be conscious of. And this is a very explicit example of that, but it can be much more subtle. And one of the main problems with Adani as a company is that they've been accused of corruption on a massive scale. So these things often come together with fossil fuel companies. But what's the challenge, and why we in the cultural sector have to be vigilant all the time, is that a lot of this has been broken by somewhere like the Financial Times, which is reported in detail on these allegations. And yet in a month's time, it's the Financial Times hosting a summit for these mining companies. And one of the kind of things that they're promoting is that Adani Enterprises, who I showed you at the start, who are doing that coal mining, are going to be in the room. And that's one of the reasons they want to invite other people in, so they can have this discussion. So the very kind of media spaces and communications channels available to us for kind of pushing back and holding the fossil fuel industry to account are also being co-opted along the way. So there's this need for us to be constantly kind of vigilant and think about where have we got agency. Now, we've seen a massive shift, which is really exciting across the cultural sector, of this big rejection of fossil fuel sponsorship, whether it's at Tate or the British Museum or the South Bank Centre and so on. But now that picture's become much more complex, and I think our lives have got a lot more difficult in a whole range of ways. And this just gives us a flavour. So is there a problem with naming rights, like with the Sackler family? Does that now apply to banks and fossil fuel companies? Do we now need to look at hedge funds and investment banks? And are there different shades of grey? And the landscape we find ourselves in is much more ethically complex in a lot of ways. But for me, I think one of the most crucial things we have to keep in mind is whether these funding relationships and these corporate sponsorships, they don't happen in isolation. If there's a power dynamic there, it's also often bound up with other problematic power dynamics that we need to be alert to. I always show this example. It's where BP sponsored an exhibition of Indigenous Australian art at the British Museum. And in that exhibition, there's objects that were the subject of restitution claims. So can we always be bringing that climate justice lens, that intersectional lens, to when we talk about these issues of partnerships and funding and sponsorship as well? And so given that these are the challenges and the issues in front of us, the questions that I'm thinking about at the moment are, how do we respond? This has suddenly become all the more complex. I thought I was just going after a BP or a Shell, but actually there are different kinds of questions we're asking ourselves. If we now know that these companies are coming to art and culture with this kind of agenda of how can we use this, how can we use it to obscure the kind of impacts on Indigenous communities that coal extraction or oil extraction is having, how can we claim or reclaim our kind of activity, our spaces, our work? And is there a way we can hold this ethical complexity so that we can move and we can be agile, we can make decisions, but we could change our mind at a later date, so we can be flexible, but can we have these strong ethical red lines as well, which I think was really integral to the way that we've seen the shift in the cultural sector, is by saying BP is beyond the pale, Shell is beyond the pale, and saying it again and again and affirming it and backing it up as well. So can we hold those positions and then also allow ourselves the room for complexity and nuance? And so just really briefly, rather than ending on that more like, oh, complex, challenging, or heavy note, some moments of optimism and excitement. What are the things that have created change? It's through partnerships and solidarity. So some of the things we've done working in partnership with these impacted communities. How can we re-center the voices of people impacted? Things like ad vans, creative protests. Who are the partners we should be working with if we're also working with a particular funder or partner? Are we holding open the space for the critical voices? What are the ways that we're using our skill sets? So through creative and artistic interventions, what are the different ways we can bring the kind of counter messages in, open up the space for a genuine debate? And often sometimes the pushback is, oh, we can have a discussion or a debate about these issues. Actually, is that really an open space? And sometimes we need to push and be forthright and use our creativity to say the conversation has to happen here and it has to happen now. And then again, this was just partly a reflection I was having this morning. We've developed all of these amazing alliances and collaborations across the sector, commitments and pledges, and of course the one that we're kind of part of today. And they're doing so much, but what else do we want to do through these alliances? And what are the gaps? What's potentially missing? Or what else could we step into that we haven't done already that starts to disrupt the systemic power picture that we're up against? And maybe I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Chris. It's always so frustrating and infuriating hearing about the webs of power and finance, but also so reassuring to hear you and your voice talking to it, and the work that you're doing, which we all obviously fully support. So thank you for coming in today and presenting for us. I think we're going to go into hear from Amy from Fun Palaces about the work that they're doing, democratizing culture in communities. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and go into your presentation. Thank you, Amy.
Hello, yes, hello everybody. So I'm normally based in South London, but I'm on holiday in Cornwall today. So I'm hoping that the Wi-Fi stays with me through this. Yes, and I'm just going to be reading today. But yes, thank you for having me. So today I want to touch on the way in which people are kept out of culture, and how I believe that more people feeling a part of the cultural landscape can benefit activist movements, and with that, the climate movement too. So yes, I'm the producer at Fun Palaces. So if you don't know Fun Palaces, we are both an ongoing campaign for cultural democracy and a weekend of action in which people make fun palaces. And our weekend is coming up on the 6th to the 8th of October. It's not too late to join in and make a fun palace this year. They can be really tiny and really last minute. And cultural democracy is an approach to arts and culture that engages everyone in deciding what counts as culture, where it happens, who makes it, and who gets to join in. So fun palaces are pop-up events that happen in existing buildings, so libraries, museums, theatres and art centres, but also housing estates, parks, community centres and back gardens. And when big cultural venues join in, instead of putting on something for their local community, we encourage them to hand over and to see how their local community would like to use their space for an hour a day or a weekend. At a fun palace, a community will share the skills, interests and culture that matter to them. And we're looking to really broaden what culture can mean. So whether it's crochet or gardening or science experiments, chapati making or building sculptures out of paper clips. Fun palaces are hands-on and they are as much for adults as they are for kids. And in fact, if people are engaging kids in a fun palace, we would say, what can they teach the adults? Like, what can the adults learn from them rather than just putting on an activity for them? We've always said everyone an artist, everyone a scientist, but under that umbrella also everyone a historian, everyone a digital creator, everyone a community leader and everyone a climate activist. And fun palaces really are about changing the world from the grassroots up and starting a revolution right on your very own doorstep. And I should also mention that fun palaces are about hyper-local culture, so the belief that we don't need to travel to the nearest big city to access culture. We've got it in our communities and on our doorsteps. So I was at a Culture Declares event last week at the South Bank Centre, and it really got me, some of the stuff that was being said there really sort of dawned on me for the first time that, or maybe sort of it's been in the back of my thinking, but the thought became very clear that in order for culture to address the climate crisis, that making work about it or just making our buildings more sustainable simply isn't enough, and that we need to really change the way culture operates. The hierarchies that we see in place in many cultural institutions are simply microcosms of the structures we see in government and other big institutions. And as was talked about by one of the speakers at the event last Sunday, when a crisis happens, these hierarchies and institutions become defunct and ineffective really, really quickly. And we know this because we saw it happen in COVID lockdowns. It was at that time, it was communities that self-organised and saw that the more vulnerable had access to food and medicines. And I'm sure everyone here witnessed that probably happen in their own communities. And this was all happening and bubbling under while the government were dithering over lockdowns and furlough and trying to sort out other support schemes. Actually, it was people on the ground that were really making the difference in those early days. And as for the culture sector, again, a speaker spoke about this at the event at the South Bank Centre. You know, we can't forget the organisations, you know, some of the ones in really big, shiny buildings that fired all of their kind of casual and 0-hour staff at the onset of the lockdowns. And we know that disproportionately affected global majority workers. And I think, you know, it's really important we don't forget that that happened. So with my Fun Palaces head in gear, it feels really obvious to me that the systems we currently have around culture aren't working. They continue to keep people out of arts and culture. And I know that at the event, democratizing culture was suggested by a couple of people across the day. And I'm really up for that because I do think that's the answer. And of course, I work as the producer for the campaign of cultural democracy. So I suppose that's to be expected. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the Fun Palaces campaign, it really seeks to bypass the gatekeepers and the hierarchies and the decision makers of all those big, shiny cultural venues and put culture back in the hands of people. And I truly wish those organisations would really take note of this, because if they want to see radical change, I really passionately believe that it starts with radical change as a process and not as a destination or an end goal. And that can start today with, you know, how buildings are used, how staff are treated, what employees' work-life balance looks like. These are all really good starting points. And whether those buildings that say that they want to engage local communities really mean it, or is it just a tick box activity? Because at Fun Palaces, we would say that truly handing over is one way of doing that. And it also has an element of risk. And I know that a lot of people aren't willing to take that risk, or they have great fears around truly handing over to communities. But the benefits do outweigh the risks. And we know that because we're about to go into our 10th annual weekend of Fun Palaces Action. And we have seen people take that risk time and time again, and how it really has put communities at the front of culture. So yeah, these are really difficult and interesting times, as we all know. And I also think there's something important about fun and play in our communities that are vital to our well-being, and also will strengthen our communities for those times when we do really have to pull together and make change down on the ground. And finally, I was just going to say that we know the cultural sector isn't representative of this country. And this is true in most of the world. And we know that the vast majority of the benefit of funded culture in the UK goes to a select few whose tastes and interests are valued and catered to. But this isn't just a leisure time injustice. When we dismiss people's interests and opinions and tastes and talents, we dismiss them not just as fluffy cultural movers and shakers, but as humans. And we dismiss not just their, and by that I mean really our, tastes and interests, but our civic input, our democratic voice, and our human brilliance. And in being part of finding solutions and hope as well. If we can't sing together, how can we bring about the revolution? If half the land's ideas are dismissed before they've had them, how will we find the new ideas that bring us hope? Fun Palaces may seem like crazy, chaotic irrelevances where people while away an afternoon, but by being part of one, we reframe who has something to offer. We connect with others and we really communicate. And yes, I truly believe that the revolution starts with a paperclip tower or geeking out about girl bands or counting the stars, because it's the revolution and it won't look like we think it will. So we need to take those risks and make messy space for it to look like itself. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Amy. It's great to hear about the work, and also, you know, the deep kind of democracy that it involves, and that's reflected in the ambitions for the CDE's hub structure as well. So I'm sure there's much more sort of alignment and work that we could collaborate on. Bridget, over to you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to Chris and Amy. That was really inspiring. So a few of you might have heard me say this before, because I used these slides at the Sunday assembly at the South Bank, but I hope it bears repeating if you've heard it before. I'll try to be quick and efficient. So, so unlocking our agency and thinking particularly about Culture Declares, who we are as a movement, what it means to declare. So what it meant to declare in 2019 when we formed, it was at the time of Extinction Rebellion and rising climate strikes. We were anticipating worse impacts coming in future. Perhaps we in Europe weren't quite living it, and it was before COVID. But we did have, you know, a strong concern about the emergency. So we came together as a growing movement of individuals and organisations declaring a climate and ecological emergency. And the key things that we very quickly decided were, this is about telling the truth, taking action, and above all, really seeking justice. It's third in the list, but it is really important. This is really a campaign for climate and ecological and social justice, really. So we held a roundhouse, an assembly at the Roundhouse in July 2019. There were 300 attendees, as we were all able to, you know, gather in such numbers then. There were strong calls for a radical change to the sector to be very much like what Amy has just talked about, you know, less commercial, more inclusive. Quite a few people referring to ethical funding relationships, and a lot of the conversations were about reducing the footprint of our practice. So, you know, a shift in practice from international touring, but, you know, there was quite a strong sense of communalism in it, you know, collectivism and communalism, and a real response to public concern and wanting people to have a voice through culture and wanting cultural organisations to give them space and voice. So from that, we then reviewed and explored what our values and structures were. So we did quite a lot of reflection, helped by COVID because we were meeting and reflecting quite a lot online. So we honed our declaration. We had a very long text, and we sort of invited people to use that, but it seemed a little bit heavy-handed. So we just reduced our declaration to this one line: we declare that the Earth's life-supporting systems are in imminent jeopardy, threatening human civilization and the biodiversity it depends upon. But we developed a number of values, that we need to act on the science urgently, that culture can pioneer transformation, and that everyone in the sector has a responsibility to explore that, you know, and to lead in that. That we had to communicate how the Earth crisis comes from deep-rooted injustices and how solutions have to consider the impacts on most affected people. So, in other words, declaring emergency shouldn't mean taking rash actions that can be hurtful to people. Committing to eliminating all forms of oppression from our work and valuing diversity of all lived experiences and cultural perspectives. So those are our values, and I can't imagine that they will change hugely in this rethinking that we're going through now. But your views are really welcome on how they need to be adjusted. So this is the new situation. There is an intensification of the emergency. Impacts are affecting the world much earlier and more extremely than most models were predicting or projecting. I mean, there are some, really extreme threats, not just, literally to the infrastructure of our lives. We're very likely to see, a global food shortage unfolding in the next months and years. Destruction of heritage and cultural property due to things like, extreme rainfall, flooding, and threats to 10,000 lives in Libya lost, 10,000 people missing in Libya yesterday due to floods. So I don't want to lay that on thick, but this is the situation that we're in now, and things will continue to worsen. So in this era, I mean, Antonio Gutierrez has called it global boiling, which is a questionable term, but it does try to convey the intensification of the emergency. So what it means now, in truth telling, well, actually, the emergency was 50 years ago. That's when we should have been really taking action. Impacts everywhere, worse than anticipated. And we should also know, most of us here are from the global north, from Europe, from the UK. Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world. In terms of action, we have to recognise the intersecting nature of the crises and try to act in multi-solving ways for well-being. We have been exploring that since the pandemic, but there's still so much more, I think, to communicate and understand. And in terms of justice, we have to be aware of the impacts on lives everywhere. For example, hunger, displacement, and damage to heritage. So sustainability it is perhaps an out-of-date approach. We have to now respond radically while we still can as civic agents, and to really work within our practices and our organizations and beyond them for systemic change. So within our organizations or our practice, when we're developing environmental action plans or sustainability plans, we have to open the envelope. So generally they are about mitigation, quite often about incremental mitigation, incremental change of things that we're already doing in order to reduce the harm and slowly, progress towards a kind of a no carbon or low carbon approach. But we have to open the envelope so that our policies are about truth, action, justice, so that they are actually about welfare, protection, the protection and care of people and biodiversity as the impacts hit. And the impacts, of course, are not just climate change, but wider intersecting harms. So decarbonising is one part of it, but we also have to think about resilience to shocks like food stress, supporting acts of reparation, being nature positive, and that means, for example, not supporting ecocide in our choices. So we have this what do we call it? Framework, Culture Takes Action framework, which offers 8 pathways for culture to take action. And the suggestion is that that as a consequence of declaring, you begin to tell truths through your work. You also decarbonize and limit ecocide in your work, but you also need to begin to include in your plans protection or preparation and adaptation. Decolonizing, so thinking about reparation and representation. And then perhaps there are 4 other pathways that might offer routes for you to specialize. So, for example, designing for life in biocentric ways, supporting your local communities to transition, to be post-oil more resilient, supporting care, so, cultural therapy, working with people and particular groups of people with needs, And then at the top there, maybe it's appropriate for you to work on global actions, collaborating for systemic change at a large scale. So those are the pathways. They might change because of this review. So, everything could change. So the question now for breaking out, and maybe before breaking out, some of you might have some clarifying questions, but we're going to use the last part of this assembly to talk about what is our energized plan of response. How do we take action for transformative adaptation while we can? I'm stopping sharing. So just checking with Victoria that that's a good idea, that we take 5 minutes or so for people to ask any questions as a whole group, and not be hustled off into breakouts. So you might want to use the reaction button to put your hand up, or
Comments in chat.
put comments in chat.
Or not.
And it could be questions for any of the speakers, perhaps, not just about what I've just said. I'm just looking at the comments here. Got some useful links being shared by Eleanor and Begum. The world has officially entered the era of climate mitigation. And there's some funding potential there. More hope. Oh, here's a hand up. Neil, thank you. Neil Romanek.
Yeah, just a general kind of practical question, I guess. Are there good, just think about funding and kind of where money goes, are there good resources or ways to look at how different cultural institutions are funded? Or I'm thinking specifically, I work in film and TV, where there's a lot of really complex funding that goes into that. If we want to start looking at where money comes from, what are good ways to start for that?
I don't know if I can answer that myself.
I wonder if that was a Chris question, or
is it a good Chris question? What do you think, Chris?
Or just Google it. Shut up, Google it.
Maybe. I think it's a fair point that the public cultural sector, because it's not, on the whole, it's relatively non-commercial, so it's much harder to get investment. We can't show a return on investment apart from social, environmental, cultural return, and that's increasingly challenged. But maybe you could just keep hold of that question. Begum, what would you like to ask?
It wasn't a question. I just want to say hi to Neil. Hi, Neil. I don't know where you are at the moment, in England or somewhere else, but that's why I invited you all to the terminal also, because I don't know how the community see these, but there are like other chances to get funding for our projects also, not only as cultural entrepreneurship or cultural responsibility, but also like as community we can actually fund each other by doing quadratic funding. So that's what I've been learning last 3 years. I'm into Web3. I know this cryptocurrency and there's mining side of it, but there are other things in there to innovate also and to make more sustainable and other things. So we have one of the community, this Green Peel community, and they are actually focusing to regenerative ways to create a regenerative finance. And also they also just support the regenerative projects and sustainability projects and many other. And they have this model they called quadratic funding. I would love to share at least that book. There's like English written book, so I can share with the community so you can have more idea about it. And we have one of the another platform which we produce hemps. You know, Mariana hemp.
Begum, I'm sorry to interrupt because we don't have very much time. This was just a phase for asking clarifying questions before we go into our breakout
yeah,
group.
Neil, I'm going to write here my mail address so you can reach out to me online on social media or by mail. I would love to support this group about the funding issue.
Thank you. Yeah, the links would be really, really useful. Any other questions before we go into some breakouts, which will be, let's say 15 minutes breakout, and then we can come back and feedback. So now I'm going to, hang on, I'm going to recreate the rooms because there were some that were too small. So I'm just going to recreate them, and you're shifting again into different rooms. I'm about to open them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you put the questions in the chat?
Oh, yes. The question, yes, hang on. Don't go into the rooms yet before you've seen the question. The question is, as I said in that, sorry, this is quite hard to find the question as I've articulated it. What do we need from the movement? That's the question. What do we need from the movement in order to create care, justice and welfare? And when we come back to feedback, then that will help inform what's our energized plan of response. Okay, so there are Jamboards to share notes.
You can share more stuff on the Jamboard or in the chat. So we need somebody from each group who'd like to go first, who feels like feeding back. Victor, it'd be great to hear from you.
I think what we basically ended up discussing in our group is the networking potential of these kind of things is just really important, especially for artists who are getting started on their climate activism journey. Skill sharing, networking, people being able to provide information to people earlier in their journeys. I think things like that is, really useful. Seem to be a common theme happening in the group.
And how would that look? It's sort of online events or place-based events?
So the first thing that I thought, and again, this is like very much me speaking from my thoughts on what other people's comments were in the breakout rooms, like feel free, anyone else to go, no, that wasn't what you were saying. The first thing that came to my mind would be things like databases of, for example, community spaces in a local area that would host a music practice or a face-to-face meeting, studios that welcome artists who do climate work, a list of funders who are willing to fund climate work, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Victor. Jamie.
We talked about the problems with getting overcapacity and stress and anxiety, and that's like more work, more networks, more stress. And could CGE provide a buddying system, both for individuals, so that across sectors and across different regions, presumably as well, that you can actually buddy each other and buddy each other to help each other get over that sort of stress. Esther also talked about how that might also work in terms of working with organizations and getting over the kind of the disarming the fear in organizations or the inertia to declare and get involved, and what that might look at and how that might work, and how important it might be to get to senior management and then to delegate down, because the experience is working with facility managers on reducing carbon footprints in venues. They don't have the capacity or the kind of remit to work curatorial or kind of change directions of production and so on. So it's kind of like, those a buddying system would be really good if CDE could get involved in that potentially.
You mean buddying from people in organisations, or buddying between
between us? So,
Yeah.
so we help each other. Like, because I got the coaching, didn't I, from Climate 2025, incredibly useful, but really a rare opportunity. So is there a way that we can help each other, like co-buddying each other individually and through organisations?
Rose, thank you, Jamie.
Myself, yes, what you've both said resonates with the conversation that we had. Lots of artists who want to take on the challenge, but how to begin? Are there enough bridges, and how to move in coordination to create a place for conversations, for support, which also could be that buddying system. And also for artists who are outside the UK, how to begin. Somebody talked about creating a hub in Central Europe, but where to begin, how to then draw on best practice, and again have that yes, that support from Culture Declares. We also talked about the necessity to maintain well-being alongside activism, and what support Culture Declares could give there. Supporting people who have burnout, which is happening more and more. And also, lastly, the notion of the local, how to work hyperlocally and then ripple out. And actually, you have a very strong foundation locally. And the idea that came out of the Scarborough museums of having that space that people can use and turn up and find support and have conversations. So build up locally, nationally, then internationally, but begin locally.
Thank you, Rose. Polly Mayrick.
Hello. I'm a bit worried about like over summarizing the group thing. I guess it's hard, isn't it, having a quick conversation? I might just end up saying my thoughts more. So sorry if I do that. Feel free to jump in, anyone else in the group. But yeah, I think the thing that I was sort of thinking and that we were talking about a bit was that sort of from the network, that kind of like having the like kind of emotional support for it, and the kind of the feeling of the community and being part of something for keeping up your like drive and motivation, but combined with the like practical support, because I think a lot of people have the drive to do something, but a lot of us are like feeling quite like hopeless and helpless and like what's the best use of this, and what can I do, and thinking about like, because I'm a member of the Land Workers Alliance, so I do a lot of farm work as well, and is something that's quite inspiring about their movement is that they have that they put a lot into the like building their sense of community and networking and stuff, but also have a lot of practical information and advice, and just like documents and policies and stuff from people that have really researched this, and speaking to someone in the group that's part of an organization and saying they've got a team and they get together and they try and work out what they can do, but feeling a bit like they're not always sure what the best thing they could do is, and maybe if there's kind of people that have spent a lot more time researching these things, like that can either write documents or information, or actually just come into organizations and kind of, or individuals, and say here are some ways in which you can actually have an impact, because I think a lot of people, they don't know as well the relative weights of different impacts and things that they can do. And so I don't know, to summarize, I guess it's just that combining of the like community and the emotional support with the like practical support, because I think especially as artists it's really easy to sort of conceptualize everything, but it's like bringing it as well down to the like, but what can you actually do? Helping people to feel less lost and overwhelmed, I think.
Thank you, Polly. I think we'll go to Gabby. I can't hear you, Gabby. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just looking at the Jamboard, what went on it. Okay, again, we also came up about databases with information about funding and philanthropists, and also possibly a mentor program around that as well. A way that Culture Declares could be more kind of loudly responsive to in the media around you know, news and issues and challenges in our world, to kind of help declarers feel represented. And what else did we have? I'm trying to find the other things that have been written. Now there are so many post-its, I can't find our ones. Yeah, that'll do for now.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Gabby. Yeah, we have, you know, in the past had a group that did, you know, wrote, well, represented the movements, but again, it's a sort of capacity thing. So that's, you know, capacity and resourcing is something as a movement we need to look very closely at, because we lean very, very heavily on voluntary and pro bono support, which isn't sustainable longer term. Is it Begum? Sorry, what do we call you? Begum Joy?
Joy, the name that I put myself last month, so I prefer to Joy, BJ. I've been thinking about it also, how we consider if we can prepare something like digital guidebook for the artists or the like cultural workers, so at least they can understand how to enter the community. And I don't know, we can put like following instructions on it, and you know, and at least they can start to transition of the place that they are working, or their art medium, or whatever they can maybe transact. It is just an idea, but that's, I mean, when I suggest someone culture declares the website also, like it is necessary sounds to at least show to guide artists.
There may be more signposting on the website. There's a huge amount of resource on the website, but maybe something that's the signposting is better for artists.
Maybe like shortly and like little short guide, you know.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to feedback?
I'll just go ahead quickly from our group. We ended up actually kind of talking about what is truth, which kind of took us off in a whole different direction. But I think it was looking for like, how do you find support for having conversations about the truth of what is going on, kind of in workplaces or among artists, or you know, people within institutions. Like, how do you facilitate, or how can the group facilitate people having those conversations where you're able to actually talk about how you really feel, and then also, it's kind of for me personally as well, like moving into more sort of corporate or business spaces. Like, how can these kind of conversations that we're having be kind of brought into that more, because a lot of those people are having and thinking the same things, but how do you kind of culture declaresify a more corporate space, or kind of allow that to happen? So I think there's maybe a sense of like, oh, they're doing their thing over there, but it's not, it's still us working there instead of somewhere else. So and then also there was a question about preparing for disaster, and how can we help facilitate preparation for disaster, you know, so that thing, as things start to come apart more, how can we, as far as culture goes, and other ways, enable preparation for that.
Thank you. And just to talk to your idea about how do we influence other sectors. So there is an alliance of declaring organisations, and there is a business declares, they're quite small but beautifully formed. So I think one of the things that we'll be looking at is really how we support those other declaring organisations and collaborate and you know, work alongside them and collectively with them. Anyone else? No, well, there is an opportunity to share more, obviously through the chat and the Jamboard, but I think we're coming into our last section, and we were going to invite you to put a little phrase or a thought in the chat about how you're doing now, how you're feeling, your responses to what's been said today. And then I will just say that everything that comes out of today, there'll be a digital zine and a report. There will be a recording when we get around to editing it, because we've been very bad at switching the recording on and off. And we'll make that available to you in the next 10 days. And finally, I'm going to give the whole hand over to Bridget, who's going to do a little reading from Cree's Tiger work.
Yes. So, yes, well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for all of the contributions this morning, whether you've spoken or just spoken in your groups or fed back. I found it actually one of the more supportive, energizing and moving sessions I've been to in quite a long time. So yeah, a lot of gratitude. I also feel a lot of gratitude for this book, for the honesty of Ben Okri, and yeah, just the beauty of his writing. So I'm just going to read the very last page, which is the anthem. And you might have heard of this anthem because it was used in a piece that was a large-scale performative work by Ackroyd and Harvey with Writers Rebel. And so they actually grew the words, the first line of this piece, in a huge piece of grass, and then they floated that on the Thames. So, can't you hear the future weeping? Our love must save the world. Can't you hear us, future fighting? We are the hope of the world. We will rise and we will dream. We heal her and keep her strong. How can we turn our times around? We must fight for this world that we love. But can you hear the future weeping? Our love must save the world. Thank you. So yeah, with that,
we're a little early yet, actually.
We are.
Well done us, and well done, and thank you so much for contributing your time. It really is invaluable to the movement, and I hope you've all got something valuable out of it. Anyone who isn't already a declarer or wants to sort of email me with any support or suggestions or ways to get involved, maybe more with the core of the organising, please kind of get in touch with me. Or if you want to be more involved in creating the strategy review, you'd be very welcome. And can I just say thanks to Gabby, because I think it was really brave what she did at the beginning, and it really set the tone for the rest of the assembly. So thank you, Gabby, and thanks everybody and all the contributors, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Our paths will cross, I'm sure. And thanks to Bridget.
Sorry, can I just respond that on 2 Wednesdays time, we're due to have a declarers breakfast. I can't remember what the theme of it is off the top of my head, but that will be another opportunity for declarers to.
And Gabby convenes that, so you can imagine the how containing and supportive it is. And thanks to Bridget, he was always wonderful and very intelligent in convening and putting together these frameworks for these sessions.
Thank you. I'm going to hang around on this call just in case anyone has any thoughts, and just so that we can do a little debrief. But should we declare it closed and that you are free to go? But you're also, you know, if you've got very specific things that you'd like to ask, then feel free to hang back.